Hello, everyone. My name is Jillian Cobb, and I am the Public Programs Producer at the National Nordic Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's virtual Meet the Author, Looking for the Hidden Folk, How Iceland's Elves Can Save the Earth. This program features author Nancy Marie Brown and filmmaker Sara Dosa, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Nancy Marie Brown is the author of several highly praised cultural histories, including The Real Valkyrie, Song of the Vikings, and Ivory Vikings. These titles have been favorably reviewed in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Economist, The Times Literary Supplement, and The Wall Street Journal, and many other journals. Brown has spent decades studying Icelandic literature and culture, and she lives on a farm in Vermont where she keeps 4 Icelandic horses and an Icelandic sheepdog. Sara Dosa is an Indie Spirit Award-nominated nonfiction director and Peabody Award-winning producer whose film explores the human relationship to non-human nature, often through tropes of allegory, myth, and magic realism. Her work has been shown at festivals worldwide, such as Sundance, SXSW, and many more. Most recently, Dosa directed Fire of Love, which premiered on opening night of Sundance 2022, where it won the Jonathan Oppenheimer Editing Award and was acquired by National Geographic Films and Neon for a 2022 release. So for today's Meet the Author, we will have some time for a Q&A at the end. So please feel free to put your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can, and I will read those out to Nancy and Sara. So welcome everyone again, and I will now pass it over to Nancy.
Thank you very much, Jillian. I hope people aren't going to be disappointed. It's going to be a lot of me and a little bit of Sara, because she is right now premiering Fire of Love on the IMAX stage for the next half hour. So you'll be hearing from me before she can join us. Let me share my screen. I think we all know. There it is, the book that we've come to learn about today. And as one of my early readers pointed out, this book is a love song for Iceland. The first time I went there in 1986, I felt I found a piece of myself that, if not quite lost, had been long suppressed. I originally conceived of this book as a collection of travel essays based on the journals of my many trips to Iceland, and I drafted some of the chapters way back in 2009. Then in the summer of 2016, on my 21st trip to Iceland, I took a walk with an Elfseer, Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir. That winter, my collection of travel essays was hijacked by the Elves. Ragnhildur and I took a walk in a lava field that she and her elf friends had protected from destruction when a new road was built nearby. We didn't talk much about elves or the hidden folk as we walked. Instead, we photographed lava crags and stacks and pillars, pillows of silver green moss, caves and clefts, and individual lichen-splashed rocks. We listened to the wind sighing in the knee-high willows and the incessant cries of seabirds, black-backed gulls barking now, 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 and Arctic terns, many terns with their piercing kriya cries. It was by turns warm and sunny and cloudy and cool, a fine summer's day. The breeze was light, just enough to keep the gnats at bay. The land smelled of peat with hints of salt and sea. We wandered about pointing out plants. I didn't keep a list, but 2 hours later, back at my hotel, when I wrote up my recollections, I remembered blueberry, crowberry, stone bramble, violet, dandelion, mountain avens, buttercup, butterwort, wood geranium, wild thyme, willow shrubs with pale, fluffy catkins, and several kinds of grass, including sheep sorrel, which we tasted. It was sour as limes. Elves cut moss was the only sign of elves I saw. We talked about art and inspiration. What is inspiration? Why do some places attract artists and spark creative thought? Why are some places beautiful? And how do you define beauty? And we shared an experience I still can't explain. Said Ragnhildur as we left the lava field, "Now, do you believe in elves?" Looking for the hidden folk is my attempt to answer that question. A question that seemed to get harder to understand the more I tried. For years, I found myself wandering through history, religion, folklore, and art, literary criticism, mythology, and philosophy, stopping along the way to dip my toes into cognitive science, psychology, anthropology, biology, volcanology, cosmology, and quantum mechanics. I used to work as a science writer for many years, you see, so my quest took some unusual turns. Each discipline, I found, defines and redefines what is real and what is unreal, what is natural and what is supernatural, what is demonstrated and what is theoretical, what is alive and what is inert. Believing in elves, I learned, is a lot like believing in quantum mechanics. It is a way of perceiving and valuing the world around us. All of the travel essays I had been working on, I realized, shared one theme. Icelanders see nature in different ways than I had been taught to see it. In Iceland, where the geology and the weather patterns are as fantastic as anything Tolkien thought up, the imagination is set free and the mind is urged to pay attention. In Iceland, I felt more alive, more open to wonder and beauty, because to the Icelanders I met, the world around us, every rock and every hill, is inhabited by elves, yes, but also by stories. Everywhere I went, people told me stories. On my first trip to Iceland in June 1986, my husband and I backpacked 4 miles from the town of Stykkishólmur to a farm named Helgafell. There had been an inch of snow that morning. In my journal, I reduced the walk to rain, bones, sheep dung, mud, some birds, Iceland gull, snipe, geese low overhead. Helgafell means holy mountain. According to the Icelandic sagas, the hill was named in 884 by Thorolf, a chieftain hounded out of Norway by King Harald Fairhair. Sailing up Iceland's west coast, he'd reached a broad bay when the wind failed. Throwing overboard a wooden post bearing an image of Thor, he declared he'd settle wherever the thunder god came ashore. That turned out to be the peninsula on which Stykkishólmur sits. Thorolfur named it Thor's Ness. On this ness, says the saga, stands a hill. To Thorolf, this hill was so holy that no one could even look at it without washing first. Nothing on the hill was to be killed, neither animals nor humans, unless they came down from the hill of their own will. Thorolf named the hill Helgafell and believed that he would go into it when he died. He may have been right. One evening, the shepherd saw the whole north face of the hill open up. Looking inside, he saw great fires burning. He heard a drinking bout going on amid raucous merriment. And as he listened, trying to catch what they were saying, he heard someone greet the chieftain, Thorstein the Codbiter, and tell him to take a seat on the bench opposite his father, Thorolf. The news came from the islands the next morning. Thorstein the Codbiter had drowned. This story was written down in the 13th century in one of the Icelandic sagas. It is one of the reasons that I walked to Helgafell in the 1980s. And when I arrived, the farm family who lived there invited me in for coffee and told me the story of the feast inside the hill. I cemented a friendship with the family at Helgafell by finding a raven's nest on the cliff. They had been looking for that nest. In Norse mythology, ravens are the wise god Odin's birds. 2 sit on his shoulders, named Thought and Memory. Icelandic folklore tells how the ravens gather each year to divvy up Iceland's farms, 2 birds to each, to become the house ravens, bringers of luck, as these ravens were for me. That day at Helgafell, my life changed. Instead of becoming a professor and teaching medieval literature, I now write books about a mysterious other world where hills are holy and stories hold lasting power. How you interpret the world, how you apply your memories, fears, hopes, and thoughts to the things you see around you defines yourself, the you eventually become. As anthropologist Tim Ingold says, each path we travel on from place to place is a thread, and each place is a knot. A knot of what, you might ask? Says Ingold, every place is a knot of stories. Some of those stories are fairy tales or elf stories. Research by folklorists has shown that most people believed in witches, fairies, wizards, and magic up through the Renaissance. Until 1750, fiction itself was known as the fairy way of writing. Most stories from Homer's Odyssey on included magic and the supernatural. If not elves, fairies, or witches, then saints, angels, devils, and miracles. To some anthropologists, storytelling itself is a kind of magic. Says sociologist Arthur Frank, stories work on people, affecting what people are able to see as real, as possible, and as worth doing or best avoided. Stories bring people together and they keep them apart. Iceland's elf stories, says folklorist Terry Gunnell, tell us how to behave in this landscape. What is right? What is wrong? When they are right or wrong? And how punishment is likely to descend on you. One of my favorite elf stories is about the great auk, a flightless black and white bird almost 3 feet tall, like a penguin. For centuries, Icelanders ate great auks and their eggs. They stuffed pillows with their feathers, fine as eiderdown. The species is now extinct. Shortly before 1862, when Jón Arnason published it in his collection of Icelandic folk tales, an old fisherman told this story. In the old days, men rowed out in open boats to hunt the great auks and collect their feathers, but they never went to the farthest end of the rocks, for that is where the elves lived. One day, a boat went to the skerries as usual. Suddenly, the sea began to get rough, so that the boat had to leave in a hurry. The egg gatherers boarded the boat again with some difficulty, all but one. He was the last down from the rocks, for he had climbed the farthest. He was left behind. His mates meant to come back for him, but the weather worsened. They gave up hope. The next year, when the egg gatherers climbed up onto the rocks, they were amazed to see a man walking where no man was expected to be. Everyone rejoiced. No one asked questions until one fine Sunday, a newborn baby was found at the church, tucked into a cradle and covered with a beautiful cloth. The pastor asked whose child it was. No one claimed it. The pastor took the auk hunter aside and asked if he didn't think the child deserved to be baptized and given a name. Choose your words carefully, the pastor warned. But the hunter said no, the child was none of his responsibility. The pastor asked a third time. Again, no. At that, a strange woman appeared, elegantly dressed, beautiful and stern. She snatched the coverlet off the cradle and tossed it to the pastor. The church can have its fee, she said. As for you, she told the auk hunter, you shall become the most monstrous whale in the sea. She picked up the cradle and disappeared. The auk hunter swelled to an enormous size, bursting out of his clothes, except for his red cap. He began to bellow horribly. People tried to hold him, to bind him with rope, but he broke free. He ran toward the sea cliffs and jumped. Thereafter, for many years, a ship-sinking, man-eating, red-headed whale patrolled the channel between Iceland's coast and the great auk skerries. What is this elf story about? Extinction. Don't hunt to the far end of the skerries, but leave the auks and elves somewhere to live in peace. Don't transgress this taboo or lie about your transgression. Or what is given to you as a blessing? The ox meat and eggs and feathers, the elf woman's love and her child will be lost, and you will be revealed as the monster you are, and your people will suffer for many years. Stories shape how you see the world. They determine not only how you think of elves, but how you think of such real things as hills and mountains and volcanoes. The stories we tell protect a place or permit its destruction. That's why it seems to me we make a critical mistake when we laugh off an Icelander's belief in elves. We assume we agree on what each of us means by belief and elf. Think about it this way. If Icelanders are crazy to talk to elves, are Christians likewise crazy to talk to God? What immaterial beings are we allowed to believe in? And who is allowed to do the believing? In 1974, an Icelandic psychologist conducted a survey on spiritual matters. Of those who responded, 5% had seen an elf, while 33%, quote, entertained the possibility of their existence. In 2006, the University of Iceland conducted a similar survey. Again, 5% said they had seen an elf. This time, more than 50% entertained the possibility of their existence. Let's put those numbers into context. According to recent surveys, 10% of Americans say they've seen a UFO, and 48% of Americans are, quote, open to the idea that alien spacecraft are observing our planet. Look at it another way. 81% of Americans say they believe in God, and 64% are convinced that God exists. So is an elf more like a UFO, or is an elf more like God? Who decides? Who organized the 2006 ELF survey? The most striking result is that in spite of the radical changes in Icelandic society since 1974, the Icelanders' traditional beliefs about elves had remained nearly the same. They were, he concluded, deeply rooted. The idea that some people can see elves and others cannot does have a long history in Iceland. When Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir wrote to the mayor on behalf of the elves living in the lava field in 2013, she called herself sjáandi, a seer. She did not have to define the term. As the Lutheran Bishop of Iceland wrote in 1570, elves are invisible to us unless they wish to appear. Yet the properties of certain men's eyes are such that no spirit can ever escape their sight. What are these properties? No one knows. Then again, seeing itself remains somewhat of a mystery. According to neuroscientist Chris Frith, the brain creates the world from the very limited and imperfect signals provided by our senses, from our experiences and our expectations, from what we've been taught and what we've read. The brain creates a prediction of what ought to be there out in the world. Eyesight doesn't answer the question, what is this? But instead, what is this like? Says neuroscientist Moshe Bar, our perception of the environment relies on memory as much as it does on incoming information. In 2010, I met this volcano. What was it like? Not a cyclops or a titan, as volcanoes were to the ancient Greeks. The classics did not shape my worldview. My volcano was a dragon. It was the dragon Tolkien desired when he, quote, desired dragons with a profound desire, adding, of course, that he did not wish to see them in the neighborhood, but the world that contained even the imagination of them was richer and more beautiful at whatever cost of peril. Here's how I describe my dragon in the book. The craters sighed and snored like a dragon's nostrils, whoosh, shush, whoosh, shush, and snorted red-orange fountains of flame. Stars fell down the sides of the new-made hills. Lava drops bounced and rolled like gold coins. Black ash peppered the snow. At the tips of the dragon's cooling limbs, the lava still moved, bulging and breaking, tinkling like broken glass, but more rhythmic and musical. As the sun set, the colors bloomed. A fat yellow tongue of living rock oozed over one crater's side. Orange eyes twinkled in the dark arms of rock. The lava fountains turned hot pink. I filled my camera's memory card. I filled my mind until my visual sense was stupefied. When I say I've seen a dragon, I'm speaking metaphorically. Elf seer Ragnhildur Jonsdottir is not. But the elf she sees may not look like any elf you might see. Elves have always been shapeshifters. The word is a bottle, the concept a liquid. Throughout history and across cultures, elves can only be seen when they wish to be seen, and they can take on whatever shapes they like. Or perhaps what's true about mountains is also true about elves. We see what we've been trained to see, what our education allows us to see. What image comes to mind when I say elf? Do you see Santa's toy makers, the Keebler elves, the Tooth Fairy, Tinkerbell? The elves Ragnhildur sees, or at least those in the illustrations of her books, look much like people, though they may be dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Some are tall, some are small. Some have pointy ears, some have green skin, but some look like trees. In the earliest stories in English, like gods and goddesses, think of Tolkien's Galadriel as so beautifully acted by Cate Blanchett. In the tale of Thomas the Rhymer from the 1200s, the elf queen is a beautiful lady on a white horse who kidnaps Thomas and turns him into a sex toy. It was Shakespeare writing in the 1600s who shrank the fairy queen to no bigger than an agate stone, the gemstone in the ring on a rich man's finger. Rather than riding a white horse, she comes in a chariot made from half a hazelnut shell and the gauzy bits of grasshoppers' wings. Where once elves were godlike, now they're insect-like. What do you see when I say troll? In the stories I knew, trolls were evil and ugly and stupid. They could be tricked, but they could never be trusted. Then Ragnhildur told me the story of a kind troll, a mountain spirit that had saved Ragnhildur's neighbor from falling down an icy hillside. That instinctive mind to distinguish evil troll from kindly spirit is a modern fault. We are obsessed with classification. Medieval people were not. Trolls, giants, monsters, elves, any of them might be human enough to have children with. They're all the same species by a modern definition of that term. In the earliest Icelandic texts, troll and elf and dwarf are interchangeable. We really have no idea what these words mean. All are used, writes folklorist Ármann Jakobsson, somewhat like a modern anthropologist might use the term God or deity. All that's clear about Iceland's elves is that they were once worshipped. Elves were declared evil by the Christian Church in the early 1200s. Around the same time, these poems and stories were first written down. Elf seers were denounced as witches, and in the 1400s, burnt at the stake in some countries. In our day, elves are not so much evil as trivial. Our world has been disenchanted. Everything can be understood by science, we think. Everything can be tamed, even if we haven't tamed it, or understood it quite yet. As sociologist Max Weber predicted in the early 20th century, soon there will be no more mysteries, no more magic, no more wonder. Ludwig Wittgenstein found that to be a serious problem. His philosophy, says historian Michael Saylor, awakens us to awe, possibility, difference, and a humble acceptance of the provisional nature of our understanding. Those are things I think about often when I'm in Iceland. Though I've never seen an elf or a troll, I've had several encounters with the supernatural while traveling in Iceland over the last 35 years. Once, while crossing the cold desert at the island's heart on horseback. One night during that horse trek, jotting notes in our cabin, I felt eyes on the back of my neck. Here's how I describe that experience in Looking for the Hidden Folk. I turned to see a glacier outside the windows, stretching across three of them and around the corner like an intelligence looming between earth and sky, gleaming yellow-white, unlike anything real, brilliant, misshapen, awake, a rising moon in wintertime, its edges blurred and shifting. It seemed to breathe. It drew me outside in spite of sore muscles. I walked dead away from it, across the tussocky field to the gravel banks of the glacial river. The day was warm, now that the clouds had lifted. I took off my boots to wade. The water was not icy in the shallows over black sand. It made me want to strip and bathe, but I was not quite alone. Other riders were about. One man perched on a rock right around the corner. I had never bathed naked in a glacial river before. I had never thought to do anything remotely like that on all my many trips to Iceland. I waded on, looking for a secret spot. Wind sang in my ears. A golden plover called, "Bee, bee." The roar of the river was louder than either wind or bird, but somehow so constant as to mimic silence. A shadow rushed across the sun. I shivered and looked up. Unknowingly, I had turned a circle. The glacier was right in my face. Wings of black cloud rising behind the ice warned me the fine weather wouldn't last, but how long did I have? There was no scale here. I could not guess how far or high that ice cap was. I walked barefoot across warm black sand braided with turf, soft and spongy and squishy with goose droppings. I decided to ignore their provenance. They felt nice between my toes. I picked up a goose feather. A series of jagged peaks beside the glacier puzzled me. They were covered top to toe with snow, while the mountains in line with them were wholly snowless and blue. Aha! I was seeing only the tips of high snow-capped peaks, their bases hidden beneath the horizon's curve. The glacier was half hidden as well. I picked up 3 rough, rounded black rocks to remember the river by, and let fly my goose feather as a gift in return. I quickened my pace and was startled to see sheep tracks way out here in the wild. The river now ran a greenish gray, milky with silt, its swirling current deadly fast. The sand petered out. I hauled myself up the high grassy bank, startling geese and goslings, and saw nothing at all around me but river, mountains, ice, and sky. No hut, no horses, no sign of human life, as if I'd stepped through a door into another world, a door into other time. That was a feeling I've never forgotten, a feeling that brought home to me how insignificant I really was, and how vast and timeless and dangerous and beautiful the earth could be. In 1992, I attended a lecture at the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, Michigan. In Iceland, scholar Julian Overing noted, The center is the margin. Geography is inside out. People settle on the temperate edges of the island, while its interior is a glacial desert, cold, inhospitable, and not even crossable at most of the year. What kind of self, she mused, might these places reflect? What kind of self has wilderness at its heart? That's another question I try to answer in looking for the hidden folk. When I first decided to go to Iceland in 1986, I had dinner with some Icelandic students at Penn State, where I worked. I told them I wanted to visit this glacier, Snæfellsjökull. They approved. The Economist said New Agers ranked the glacier the second most holy mountain in the world, after a peak in the Himalayas. The mother of the seismologist who was visiting added, I know what they mean. I have never felt it like I felt it there. She did not define it. Each of my succeeding trips to Iceland has been made or marred by catching sight of the glacier or failing to. My journals are rich with sightings or the wish for them. Went horseback riding for over 4 hours, I wrote. The glacier kept itself hidden. No glacier, the clouds are too thick and low. No glacier, but some other mountains came and went. No glacier yet. The glacier kept staring at us, beautiful and mysterious, two horns on top, like eyes on a skate, the glacier all white. This feeling of being drawn toward a magic mountain is universal. Other writers feel it about Mount Ararat in Turkey or Mount Antake in Japan. The word one writer uses is not magic, but holy. Another word that applies is wonder. Wonder is an emotion. According to philosopher Jesse Prince, it's wonder that produces both religion and science, as well as art. The three institutions that are most central to our humanity, he says, are united in wonder. They're not in conflict. They're not either or. Each allows us to transcend our animality by transporting us to hidden worlds. It's wonder, he argues, that makes us human. There's much we don't know about the brain, but we know it categorizes. We know it uses concepts and words, finds causes, and crafts stories. We know it constantly simulates the world and makes multiple predictions of what we will sense and see and what we should do in response. We know that it's wired for emotion, for wonder, for ecstasy, but that Western culture disdains and derides this side of the brain. We're taught to control our emotions, to give up wonder in childhood, to stifle our mystical experiences, or at least not to talk about them. Otherwise, we'll be thought ignorant, eccentric, or unwell. We'll be laughed at as loony elf seers. But without words, without the concepts they describe, you are experientially blind. Wonders may be all around you, but you will not see them. Your beliefs define you. As fuzzy, illogical, or unquestioned as they may be, they control how you see the world and how you act in response. What does it mean to believe in elves? When Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir invoked the elves to stop the destruction of the lava field by the new road, she was dismissed as a loony elf seer by an American journalist reporting on the dispute. Here's the advice she gives in her book, What Does It Take to See an Elf? Find a rock you feel drawn to. Sit down and be comfortable. Look at the rock. Notice its shape, its texture. Is there moss growing on it or lichen? Are there any plants around? What colors are they? Do they have a smell? Do you feel the breeze? Are there any sounds? Did you see a movement out of the corner of your eye? Keep still and wait. It might be an elf coming out to play. Allow yourself to enjoy the adventure. And here's my favorite part. It is also fine if you think all this is imaginary, she says. We all tell stories, we always have, but we don't always take responsibility for the effects of our storytelling. Our culture doesn't think storytelling is sacred, writes Ursula K. Le Guin. To her, writers pursue a sacred calling. If you believe that words are acts, as I do, she says, then one must hold writers responsible for what their words do. In looking for the hidden folk, I invite you to join an intimate conversation about how we look at and find value in nature. I hope to reveal how the words we use and the stories we tell shape the world we see. I argue that our beliefs about the earth will preserve or destroy it. Scientists name our time the Anthropocene, the human age. Climate change will lead to the mass extinction of species unless we humans change course. Iceland suggests a different way of thinking about the earth, one that to me offers hope. Icelanders believe in elves, and you should too. That's the end of my formal presentation. And I was going to invite Sara Dosa to ask me some questions now, but Sara is on the stage at the IMAX Theater premiering the film, her new film called The Fire of Love, about the volcanologists Maurice and Katja Kraft. So we're going to have to delay that a little, and I will turn the floor over to you, Jillian, to see if we have some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions here. Do you have access to the question and answer? It should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Someone asked, are you the person who lived a summer on the farm where my great-grandparents lived before they immigrated in the 1880s to Canada? It was located on the ocean close to a city that I do not know how to pronounce.
This is the glacier that I was just showing you pictures of, Snæfellsjökull. I do see the question now. And yes, I am the person who lived the summer on the farm at Little Lava. Some of that story is retold in Looking for the Hidden Folk. I also wrote about it in my book, A Good Horse Has No Color, and my husband wrote about it in a book called Summer at Little Lava. This was a wonderful house that was pretty much a concrete tent. The people who had grown up in that house, Dawn's great-grandparents, and after that had lived in a turf house, a sod house, you might say, a house built of turf, bricks, and rocks, and probably driftwood. On that site for about 1,000 years. It's one of the farms that was settled in the Saga time. When we got there, the family had given up their turf house and had built a concrete house that was, all the rage in the 1940s when after or during World War II, when concrete technology came to Icelandic house building. And the idea that they could have built this concrete house on the far side of a lava field where there was no road and you had to take all your building materials across the tide marsh at low tide through what we called the sucky mud. How they got all the materials over there is really surprising. It's also surprising to me that they gave up before the house was finished and they moved to Reykjavik, as many, many farmers did in the 1940s and afterwards, when Icelanders decided that living on farms was quite a bit too much work, and they went into the city. So the friend that I rented the house from, her mother had grown up there, and the extended family still owned the house, but they didn't visit it except in the summer for short periods of time because it had no running water, it had no heat. it was essentially a concrete tent, and it was probably the most wonderful place I've ever lived in my life. And I cried when I had to leave because the view of the glacier out the windows was magnificent. And we walked every day in the lava field and got that sense of the earth being so alive as the birds and the animals and the vegetation inhabit a lava field, inhabit the rock, and create this new harmony. It's really an amazing place. Another question I see here is, are many of the wonderful photos in the book? And yes, I'm happy to say that they are. My publisher really went all out on this book and gave me 16 pages of color pictures inside, which is really hard to imagine in this day and age. It makes it an expensive book, but it's also a very beautiful book. I see another question here. In 2015, Ali says, I visited Iceland and went to Elf School in Reykjavik, taught by Professor Magnus Skarphéðinsson. It was an afternoon session discussing elves in Iceland. Are you familiar with the Elf School, and have you worked with Professor Skarphéðinsson? I am familiar with the Elf School, but no, I have not attended, and I did not talk with Professor Skarphéðinsson. I focused on the elf seer Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir exclusively in the book, but there are other ways of looking at the elves also. Let's see, another question here. So many parallels I see in the beliefs and mythology of Northern Europeans and North American tribes. Any observations on these similarities? I'm glad you raised that, Dan, because one of the books that is being talked about widely right now is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who just won a MacArthur Genius Grant. And her way of using Native American stories and science to look at how we can live better in balance with nature has so many echoes to what Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir taught me about using the stories of the elves and the beliefs in the elves that have existed in Iceland for 1,000 years to learn and to teach others how to live in harmony with nature. The quality of the stories and the quality of the nature are different because we're talking about forests in North America versus lava fields in Iceland, but the intent is the same. And I really like the way my book talks to some of the same themes that Kimmerer brings up in Braiding Sweetgrass. So I definitely would recommend that. I also had a person that came to one of my earlier talks who noted these connections between the Native American and the Icelandic stories and urged me to go looking for the elves in my own woods, which is something that I really ought to be doing. I find that in Vermont, where I live, nature is sometimes overwhelming. There are so many different tree species and so many different bird species and so many different plants that, as the story goes, I see the forest, but not the trees. I don't see the individuals. And in Iceland, it being so spare and elemental, it's really easy to learn the names of pretty much every bird species, every flower that you're going to see. I'm not too good on the grasses yet. I can probably do every tree because there's very few, and I can definitely do every land mammal because there's only one native mammal, and that's the Arctic fox. So it's sort of like the child's version of learning nature. And then you can maybe move on to the more complex ecosystems.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Nancy. I do believe Sarah, if we want to pause questions really quick, I believe Sarah is online now. So I can pass it over to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi, I can't quite get on video, unfortunately, just yet. I think if I made the host, I'll be able to pop on as if an elf wanting to be seen. Let's see here.
There you are. Welcome back, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with you all today.
So I was going to start by asking you a question, and you also need to tell us a little bit about the film, The Seer and the Unseen, because although the Nordic Museum played it last night, not everyone in the audience may have had the opportunity to see it. But what I wanted to ask you, do you want to do that first, and then I'll ask you a
Sure.
question?
Yeah, I'll be happy
Okay,
to.
thank you.
So The Seer and the Unseen is a film that follows the story of Rakelder Jonsdottir, who you've met through Nancy's work today, who is a seer. She finds herself kind of at the heart of national media attention as she and her group of activists are trying to shut down the construction of quite a needless road project that was very much kind of politically important in this moment of recovering from the financial collapse in Iceland that devastated the country in 2008. So the film kind of follows Raka's relationship with hidden beings, but also kind of dives into the economic history of the country and asks these questions about the belief in the invisible, whether it's invisible elves or the quote unquote invisible hand of the free market, and how these ideas kind of come into play through this very personal story. We think of it as a magically real documentary, which to some people might seem oxymoronic, but we really tried to dwell within Raka's perspective and see the world through her eyes. And this is, of course, a world where, there's an elf cathedral in a boulder where life can be found everywhere. And so it was a true joy to make the film, and also now to have Nancy's book out in the world, because there's a lot of resonance between the work and with Rakelder as kind of a muse for both of us.
That was one of the things that was so amazing when I saw Sarah's film for the first time, was that she and I both understood Rakelder and her elf stories in the same way, that these were ways of teaching us to learn and to live in balance and harmony with nature. And as Sarah points out, elves may be invisible, but so is money, so is economics. And yet all of our society is based on this concept that the more money you get, the better person you are. Why do we believe that? And we don't believe, the truths that the elves are telling us about living in balance with nature. But my question was really kind of backing up. I met Sara at the Icelandic premiere of this film, and the first thing that came to mind was how seriously she took Raka. And I said, how did you get past your instinct to laugh? Because when I say I know somebody who believes in elves, people always just laugh at that. The idea that talking to elves is somehow childish or loony, or so how did you get past that, I don't know, instinct that we have in America that there must be something strange about believing in elves?
Yeah, I think for me, it was perhaps twofold. I grew up with a mother who is a cultural anthropologist, and I studied cultural anthropology as an undergrad and as a graduate student. And there's many frameworks within anthropology of understanding cultural languages, their own logic, and that's to be respected and to be understood. And so I very much approached the belief in hidden beings with that same kind of lens of that this has been part of Iceland's cultural history for so many years. I wanted to understand it. I didn't find it necessarily funny or something to be laughed at. I wanted to kind of see the world from that perspective. And once I met Raka, she is just such an incredible, charismatic and wise person that you can't help, at least for me, I couldn't help but want to believe. I felt like the way she saw the world and how she described her encounters with her elf friends, and just the reciprocity and her relationship with nature that her belief in elves afforded. That was a powerful way that taught me a lot about living, actually. So rather than finding it funny per se, I found it deeply meaningful. And the more I learn about it, the more I cherish it. I feel kind of lucky that I never had that instinct actually to ever laugh at her. I laugh at, she's very funny. She's a very,
right. You can laugh with her. It's very playful.
I like to laugh. I like to laugh at her that way.
Yeah. No, you're right, because it's very playful. I think that's one of the things that's very makes me very hopeful about sharing the elf story and the elf lore, is that it's a very humorous, very fun way of approaching this terribly depressing concept of climate change and the Anthropocene and how we are destroying things. And the Icelanders come back with this wonderfully optimistic way of looking at the world, saying, well, we just have to work together with our elf friends and we can fix it.
Yes.
That is like so hopeful. So you're going to ask me a question now.
Yes. Speaking of playfulness in Iceland, I've loved Icelandic language, and I'm a total beginner. But you being a wordsmith, I would imagine words and Icelandic language has been something that has really intrigued you for some time. One of my favorite kind of moments with some of my Icelandic friends was I had one friend tell me about this phrase, "Kynta upp húsið," and I'm sure my pronunciation is quite bad, but she said it loosely translates into like heat up the house or warm up the house. But when you break it down, it actually literally translates into sheep up the house. And it refers to the time of when, in the croft houses, when shepherds would bring their sheep into the house to keep the sheep safe, but also to warm themselves up in the heart of winter. And so I just love that moment because there's a lot of cultural history embedded in kind of slang. So I'm wondering, since elves and hidden folk are such an important part of Icelandic cultural history, I'm just wondering about times that you've encountered just fun, interesting, or insightful turns of phrase that show kind of how they're woven in a day-to-day quotidian basis.
Well, because I'm a wordsmith in English, I am not one in Icelandic. I remember this book that Jesse Byock produced, a wonderful series called Viking Language, so, how to teach yourself Old Norse. And I already knew Old Norse, but I bought it anyway. And he points out that in order to read the Icelandic sagas, you only need to know about 250 words.
Oh, wow.
So I know 250 Icelandic words really well. And then there's all these other words and phrases I don't understand. So I'm really like a child when people speak to me in Icelandic. They have to break it down to very childish, terms. But when what your question makes me think of is this story. I told part of the story of Helgafell, the Holy Mountain, which comes from Erbyggi saga. And there is an earlier holy place in this saga. It's the meadow or the plain where the district thing is held, the meeting or assembly. Mm-hmm. And this meadow is polluted in the story by the chieftain's enemies, who refuse to walk to the rocks offshore to go to the bathroom, complaining that they were wearing out their shoes for no good reason. Mm-hmm. Except the euphemism that they used to go to the bathroom was to drive away the elves. Really? The phrase in Old Norse is at ganga til áfrekka. It's like, the euphemism we have for answering the call of nature. Yeah. Well, theirs is to drive away the elves. And that saga was written in the 1200s. And the story itself probably dates back to the late 800s. Wow. So this concept shows you, how embedded in Icelandic culture the idea of the elves are, and that they are representatives of nature that human pollution will drive away. And if I can just go off on a tangent here, I also think of that word I just used, thing. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In English, a thing is an object. It's something that's not considered to be alive. It's the opposite of a person or a place. You think of person, place, or thing. But that word in English comes directly from Old Norse. And the Old Norse meaning of thing is a meeting or a gathering of people to decide on how we're going to live in harmony. And I haven't researched the question of how the meaning of that word changed so English, from one language into another. But, just thinking about it, and this has been bothering me for the last couple of days, it seems to sum up the difference in worldview between our two cultures. Mm-hmm. You have this one word thing, and one culture describes it or defines it as a meeting, mm-hmm. and the other as an inert object. Yeah. So you kind of think about that. It's like, yeah. I don't know where I'm going with that,
No, I
but
love that. That's
maybe I'll,
beautiful.
try to take that a
Wow.
little farther.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And yeah, and in terms of, yeah, the cultural interpretations of that is really powerful. Oh, amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, so I want to ask you a question because you live in a city, Berkeley, I think.
Yes.
And though you and I immediately, saw that what Rockhill's message was an environmental message, and that her elf friends are stewards of nature, and they're trying to remind us that humans are dependent on the earth. It's not the other way around, that we have to live in balance. And as I mentioned before, you joined us. On Iceland, it's really easy to see how valuable every little bit, every scrap of inhabitable land is, because Iceland is so small and so much of it is uninhabitable desert, volcanic desert, glacial desert. The whole center of the island you can't cross in the wintertime. And, so we can see why people would agree with Brackhilder and the Elves that this tiny little patch of lava field where the birds nested and the flowers grew was important. How do we translate that sense to the United States, where it is so vast and it seems like who cares how much you pave over because there's always more nature out there? How can we teach people in the cities, to find that sense of wonder and that sense of value in nature?
That's such a great question. For me, being in a city and after spending so much time in Iceland, I haven't been there 30 times like Nancy has, but I've been there 11 and I hope to keep going back. I want to be like a migrating Arctic tern and return every year. But it's the contrast of being in Iceland and then coming back home to live in a city has been quite a contrast. At times it's felt abrasive and destabilizing. But I feel like over time, learning to incorporate some of the messages that I've learned through Rakhildur, as well as just time spent in nature in Iceland, trying to integrate that into my daily life in the United States has been really meaningful. I think the thing that Raka says, and this is also something that is kind of a main theme in the seer and the unseen, is that if you can listen deeply, you can hear the elves. And if you listen to silent places, that's how you can hear elves. And one interpretation of that too is if you can quiet things down and focus on simple beauties, you can be met with a kind of wonder and expansive life force all around you. And I've delighted on simple things like a spider's web that glints in the light and you all of a sudden see rainbow. And Raka talks about how elves play with the light. And so for me, seeing spiders play with the light in that way can kind of connect me to that feeling. So small, yet somehow connects me with the expansiveness of the wilderness in Iceland. Things like a tree, a bird flying, finding that kind of, that connection has really helped me.
It's really neat the way that you and I have responded exactly the same way, because if I was going to answer that question, from my point of view, I sometimes when I go out walking in our woods in Vermont, I walk the same path every day. I have this routine, this is my lunch break. I go out on this walk, I take my dog, and sometimes I'm just listening to all these voices in my head saying what I'm supposed to do that day, or I missed this deadline, or this deadline's coming up, or I have this talk to give. I just say, stop. You are on a walk of wonder. You are on a walk of awe. And I make myself count 20 wonderful things that I see, in 40 minutes or whatever. So, you have to keep looking until you see the next thing, like, like you said, the spider web or the mushroom, or the way the light is hitting the aspen trees that are quaking and trembling, and those things that you just take the time to stop and look and to listen. And I think that's really, what the message of the elves is.
Yeah.
I want to ask Jillian, our host, how we're doing for time here. I see we have run our hour out.
We do have a few I do want to answer a few questions. So this one actually for Sarah, a few people in the chat have asked how they are able to see the seer and the unseen. So if you could give us a little bit more information about where we can find that.
Sure. So I should say The Seer and the Unseen came out in 2019. We were lucky to have a wonderful film festival release. However, once it was going to be released theatrically, the pandemic hit. And so it was in a few theaters, but we didn't get to enjoy the kind of theatrical release we were hoping for this film. Though we did meaningfully get to see it play in Iceland. It did do a theatrical release there. But now the best way to access it is online. If you go to our website, which is .com, there is a tab that says watch, and that lists all the places to watch it. But briefly, Apple TV tends to be the most accessible one for people living in the United States. Internationally, it's on a service called Documentary Plus. It's also on Ovid TV, which is kind of a new boutique kind of art, film, and documentary streaming service. So those are the main places, but we're hoping the film will kind of enjoy a new kind of distribution. And I really hope people will see the resonance between the film and Nancy's beautiful work in her book.
Yeah, if only we could package them together. I have to look into that, Sarah. Yeah. The next edition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we have a few others. Somebody asked, I had an experience near Port Townsend in a small wood full of mushrooms. Any elf tradition in the Pacific Northwest?
I don't know anything about the Pacific Northwest, I'm afraid. There probably are traditions of spirits in the forest there. There have to be. But maybe they're not called elves, and you should probably check with the Native American peoples that lived in the area. They would have stories, I'm sure, to explain.
Just to briefly weigh in, the first film I directed is called The Last Season, and it's about mushroom foragers in the woods of Oregon. And it follows the story of a Cambodian man who came to the US after the Civil War in Cambodia, and an American man who's part Native American who was a sniper in Vietnam. And the film tells the story of their kind of unlikely friendship that then turns into a family relationship. But they told me many stories actually about spirits of the woods, coming from indigenous cultural languages, as well as ones from Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of people who are sensing nature beings, as well as ancestors in the forest. So just to share my personal experience of encountering them, but they're certainly present.
Wonderful, thank you for that. We have, I think, two more. We'll do our last two. So the first, it seems most of your encounters are random. Is there a regular practice that might play a part in making believing and acting with elves easier?
Well, the way Raka does it is she goes to the same place. So there's a certain rock where she's had experiences before, and she goes back and she will interact with the elves who live in that rock. I'm not sure that they speak to her every time she goes, but she will go regularly to the same place. I have not been that lucky. For me, it is a random encounter, mostly because, as I said before, I'm usually too busy to calm down and just sit and listen and open myself to the experience. It's much more likely I'll do that in Iceland because that's what I go to Iceland for. To do that in Vermont, I would have to, not bring my dog with me or something to actually have that sort of thing. But I think if you can get into a regular, routine of going to the same place and just sitting and opening yourself to what might happen, that you could have maybe less random encounters with the other world. What do you think, Sarah?
I think that's a great question. For me, whenever I've had feelings of, oh yeah, this seems to describe what Raka, for example, experiences when she's with her elf friends. I'm in places of profound kind of natural beauty, and I'm kind of caught off guard by I'm almost moved to tears. It feels like a real power. And so there's some kind of patterns that I feel like I know exactly the part right outside of there's a bridge. Well, I'm getting into the weeds of Icelandic geography, but suffice to say there's very specific parts of that country. But also, Nancy, to your question about in my daily life, there's a tree on a walk near my house in Berkeley, California, where I always kind of have a sense of there's something more here. I feel like whenever you can really perceive the interconnectedness of the ecology, those are places where it seems like, oh, perhaps elves are caretaking for these relationships. At least I feel like that's a delightful way to think about it all. So for me, those are what I see. But yeah, Raka, she has so many elf friends and other beings that she's friends with that I feel like she can conjure them pretty quickly and tap into them wherever she might be, wherever they are as well.
Wonderful, thank you both. And our last question to Sara, how did you get from cultural anthropology to filmmaking?
It's a long story. I'll do my best to keep it short, but I loved cultural anthropology. And as I said, my mother was a professor of cultural anthropology. She's now retired. I feel like anthropology framed questions in a way that really spoke to me, always looking about cultural meaning as well as interrogating relationships of power. And so seeing the world like that has given me so much and has kind of shaped kind of just my pathway and how I feel like I perhaps am in the world. There's a resonance there too with documentary filmmaking of getting to kind of ask questions, to think about cultural meanings, to look at relationships, to try and understand kind of truth and power. So it actually wasn't too hard of a jump from academia to filmmaking. I personally, I was going on a pathway to become a professor as well, and I was loving my studies, but I often bumped into what felt like a lot of limitations of academia, where I thought that storytelling and making art perhaps had perhaps for me personally was a more expansive way, a more accessible way to kind of ask the questions I was interested in asking. I have so many friends in academia, and this is by no means a slight against their work, but for me personally, I found myself just more gravitating in that direction. And actually, my very first film, the mushroom hunting film, the last season, was inspired by the work of an anthropology professor. Anna Singh is her name. So it was a very kind of clear ramp going from my anthropological work and then finding filmmaking as the new vehicle to ask those questions and play with those frameworks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for being here today and for this wonderful conversation. I will plug in our next Meet the Author event is going to be held at the museum on October 22nd at 11 a.m. And we'll feature Henrik Berggren and Lars Tragar in their book, The Swedish Theory of Love, Individualism, and Social Trust in Modern Sweden. So thank you everyone for your engagement today. And we look forward to seeing you at the museum soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.